kids, it's time for another episode of the Grandpa Stewart Show. Oh, it's Grandpa Ken David Stewart. Yes, indeed, here we are. Only I can't find Harley tonight. I don't know where Harley the hog is. Oh dear. I wonder if we'll be able to find him. I like Harley so much. He's one of my best friends in the whole world. Oh, oh, don't worry. Don't worry, Kermit. Uh, I'm sure we'll find Harley somewhere in this house. Uh, you know, we have a little dog in the house called Snuggles, and sometimes she likes to pick up toys and stuffed animals, and she may have picked up Harley last night and put him someplace under the couch or something. Oh, I hope so. I sure hope so, because I really miss my Harley already. Okay, guys, I'm sure we'll find Harley by tomorrow anyway. I hope. Okay, last night we were reading the Twits, and tonight we're going to read the next chapter. We found all about Mr. Twit and the grossness of his beard and food and chunks of food that got cut up in that. And I hope you didn't eat supper right after that or something, or right after supper wouldn't be good. But now we're going on to Mrs. Twit. Mrs. Twit was no better than her husband. She did not, of course, have a hairy face. It was a pity she didn't, because that, at any rate, would have hidden some of her fearful ugliness. Take a look at her. Well, we'll see how well, if you can see that. I don't know how it's going to show up on the video. But believe me, she's pretty homely, yeah. Have you ever seen a woman with an uglier face than that? I doubt it. But the funny thing is that Mrs. Twit wasn't born ugly. She had quite a nice face when she was young. The ugliness had grown upon her year by year as she got older. Why would that happen? I'll tell you why. If a person has ugly thoughts, it begins to show on their face. And when that person has ugly thoughts, every day, every week, every year, the face gets uglier and uglier until it gets so ugly you can hardly bear to look at it. A person who has good thoughts cannot ever be ugly. You can have a wonky nose, and a crooked mouth, and a double chin, and stick out teeth, but if you have good thoughts, they will shine out of you, out of your face like sunbeams, and you will always look lovely. Nothing good shone out of Mrs. Twit's face. In her right hand she carried a walking stick. She used to tell people this was because she had warts growing on the sole of her left foot, and walking was painful. But the real reason she carried a stick was so she could hit things with it, things like dogs and cats and small children. And then there was the glass eye. Mrs. Twit had a glass eye that was always looking the other way. Gee, the story's almost getting a bit scary, isn't it? The next chapter is called The Glass Eye. You can play a lot of tricks with a glass eye because you can take it out and pop it back in again anytime you like. You can bet your life Mrs. Twit knew all the tricks. One morning she took out her glass eye and dropped it into Mr. Twit's mug of beer when he wasn't looking. Mr. Twit sat there drinking the beer slowly. The froth made a white ring on the hairs around his mouth. He wiped the white froth on his sleeve, then wiped his sleeve on his trousers. "You're plotting something," Mrs. Twit said, keeping her back turned so he wouldn't see that she'd taken out her glass eye. "Wherever you go all quiet like that, I know very well you're plotting something." Mrs. Twit was right. Mr. Twit was plotting away like mad. He was trying to think of a really nasty trick he could play on his wife that day. "You better be careful," Mrs. Twit said, "because when I see you starting to plot, I watch you like a wombat." "Oh, do shut up, you old hag," Mr. Twit said. He went on drinking his beer, and his evil mind kept working away on the latest horrid trick he was going to play on the old woman. Two very mean people here. Suddenly, as Mr. Twit tipped the last drop of beer down his throat, he caught sight of Mrs. Twit's awful glass eye staring up at him from the bottom of the mug. It made him jump. "I told you I was watching you," cackled Mrs. Twit. "I've got eyes everywhere, so you'd better be careful." This kind of reminds me of some of the old fables or fairy tales. It can be, well, downright scary at times. Okay, the story goes on. The next chapter is called The Frog. To pay her back for the glass eye in his beer, Mr. Twit decided he would put a frog in Mrs. Twit's bed. He caught a big one down by the pond and carried it back secretly in a box. That night, when Mrs. Twit was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, Mr. Twit slipped the frog between her sheets. Then he got into his own bed and waited for the fun to begin. Mrs. Twit came back and climbed into her bed and put out the light. She lay there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was itching. Dirty old hags like her always have itchy tummies. Then all at once she felt something cold and slimy crawling over her feet. She screamed. "What's the matter with you?" Mr. Twit said. "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit, bouncing about. "There's something in my bed." "I'll bet it's that giant skillywiggler I saw on the floor just now," Mr. Twit said. "That what?" screamed Mrs. Twit. "I tried to kill it, but it got away," Mr. Twit said. "It's got teeth like screwdrivers." "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit. "Save me! It's all over my feet." "It'll bite off your toes," said Mr. Twit. Mrs. Twit fainted. Mr. Twit got out of bed and fetched a jug of cold water. He poured the water over Mrs. Twit's head to revive her. The frog crawled up from under the sheets to get near the water. It started jumping about on the pillow. Frogs love water. This one was having a great time. When Mrs. Twit came to, the frog had just jumped onto her face. This is not a nice thing to happen to anyone at bed at night. She screamed again. "By golly, it is a giant skillywiggler," Mr. Twit said. "It'll bite off your nose." Mrs. Twit leapt out of bed and flew downstairs and spent the night on the sofa. The frog went to sleep on her pillow. Yes, and I think we'll leave it for there for today, boys and girls. It's a very silly story. Don't take it seriously. We're just reading this for the fun. The book you can find in your public library, I'm sure, called, or you can reserve a copy if they don't have it in right now. It's called The Twits by Roald Dahl, and some of you may even have this in your school library at school. Because I can remember when I was a school teacher, I used to read this one to my kids, and they really enjoyed it. And remember, kids, reading is cool. Reading is very, very cool. So keep up the books, keep up the reading, and we'll see you tomorrow night.